Hi, welcome to Human Trafficking Education Seminars for Hotels, Motels, and Public Lodging Establishments. Part 1. What is human trafficking? The legal definitions of human trafficking are as follows. These definitions come to us through the TVPA, or the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. So labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjectification to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. Sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. Involuntary servitude is a condition of servitude induced by means of any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that if the person did not enter into or continue in such condition, that person or another person would suffer serious harm or physical restraint, or the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. Debt bondage is the status or condition of a debtor arising from a pledge by a debtor of his or her personal services or of those of person under his or her control, a security for debt, if the value of those services as reasonably assessed is not applied toward the liquidation of the debt, or the length and nature of those services are not respectively limited and defined. The term commercial sex act means any sex act on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. So this does not necessarily have to include cash money. So we spoke about some pretty hefty legal definitions that came out of the TVPA. So in the year 2000, the federal government created the TVPA, or the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And what it simply stated was, of course, some of the legal definitions you've already heard, but we're going to break it apart and break it down a little bit so we can understand better what exactly that law states and where the crime of human trafficking differs from other crimes. So the federal government said, you know what, in order for us to classify a crime as a human trafficking crime, one element from each of these categories has to be present in order for it to be classified as human trafficking. So it's got to be one act of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, or selling by a means of force, fraud, or coercion for purposes of exploitation, whether for sexual, laborious purposes, or some other exploitation, involuntary servitude, forced military, or debt bondage. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the purposes of, and we're going to work our way backwards. So starting with debt bondage, and first of all, before we get into that, I want to make sure we're clear on the definitions when it comes to how we classify or define survivors. So when we talk about survivors or victims, we're typically talking about those who are domestic and foreign nationals. So domestic victims are those who are born and raised here or have legal citizenship within the United States. Foreign nationals are those who come from outside the United States. So keep in mind, many of these elements can apply to both. So here we go. So debt bondage, we're going to take an example, okay, of Emily. She's 22 years old. She lives in Germany. She found an ad on the internet that says, you know what, be a waitress in the United States, make $2,000 a month. Just call this job recruiter. So she's like, awesome. So she calls up this job recruiter and they say, you know what, come on out for an interview. She gets there and there's a few other people there and everything feels very legitimate, very professional. And she goes through the interview process and they get to the end and there's two interviewers and they say, you know what, you would be a great candidate to get to the United States. We would love to bring you, but we need $1,000 from you in order to pay for your transportation and your legal documents to get in and out of the country. So Emily So, all right, well, I have $1,000, right? Well, let's say, for instance, Emily doesn't have $1,000, and her job recruiters are now saying, you know what, we'll loan you the $1,000 to get you there, and you can just pay us back once you start working. Well, before she's even sealed the deal, she has accrued herself a debt before she's even stepped into the United States. So we'll say, for instance, for sake of argument, Emily does have $1,000. She gives it to her job recruiters. They get her all the transportation stuff set up, and they get her documents to get here to the United States. And take special note here, most people who come from outside the U.S. for the purposes of trafficking come with legal documents. They come with temporary visas, student visas, work visas. They get here and disappear. So Emily, she's now got her transportation, she's got her documents in place. She gets here to the United States with her escorts, with her job recruiters, and they say, you know what, let us hang on to your documents for safekeeping, right? And then they tell her, you know, you don't have the right kind of visa to work as a waitress in the United States, so if they catch you, you're going to get in serious trouble. So here she is, she doesn't have any control of her documentation, her identification. She doesn't speak the language, and now she's fearful of authority. And they tell her, you know what, it didn't cost us $1,000 to get you here. It cost us $3,000 to get you here. And now you're going to work in this strip club to pay it off before you're free to go. This is debt bondage. So what debt bondage says, basically, is the debt never goes away, because now Emily is being provided for with food, shelter, clothing, getting her hair done, her nails done, right? And the bill gets higher and higher and higher, and that debt never goes away. So we often see this with foreign nationals and domestic victims when it comes to the promise of a job, right? So we often have that debt piece right away. So when it comes to forced military, we don't see this here in the United States. We don't see this in Canada, Australia, parts of Europe. We don't see this where there is a well-formed government military system. We see this in areas that are going through war. We see this in areas or have recently gone through war. We see this in areas where we have underdeveloped nations, communities, tribes. So we don't necessarily see this forced military piece in places, again, where we have well-formed government military systems. When it comes to involuntary servitude, this is straight up slavery. We don't have this big debt bondage piece going on. This isn't I owe you money or I'm paying back a debt. This is simply I'm working in this house as a nanny, I'm working in this hotel, I'm working in this factory, on this farm for my very survival. They provide me with food to eat, clothes to wear, a place to sleep. That's it, right? We don't have this big I'm going to pay you back piece going on. When it comes to exploitation, whether for sexual or laborious purposes, those are the two main types of trafficking we're going to talk about because that's what's prevalent here in the U.S. Human trafficking has always got an element of exploitation. You're always going to look for that form of trade. Where is the trade? And exploitation simply means somebody's gaining from somebody else's loss. Loss of freedom, loss of wages. So the means of force, fraud, or coercion. So let's talk about this for just a minute and break these down. So when we talk about force, we're talking about physically taking somebody against their will, physically holding them against their will. We're talking about beatings, rapes, that kind of thing. So here in the United States, we're talking about less than 3%. Of those who are trafficked, less than 3% are actually kidnapped for the purposes of trafficking. So I know it's what we often see in the media. It's what we often see in Hollywood. It is not an accurate representation of how trafficking actually happens here in the U.S. So when we talk about fraud and coercion, we're talking about a process called the grooming in process. So fraud is that tricking piece, right? I promised you one thing, I delivered something completely different. So Emily was frauded into the system, right? She thought she had job recruiters who were actually traffickers. She was promised a job as a waitress. She was delivered into servitude as a stripper. So when it comes to fraud, it's that tricking piece. And it might even be, you know what, he promised me we're going to get married, we're going to live out in the country, we're going to have kids, it's going to be an amazing life, right? And a month later, he's making dates on his cell phone, taking her to the nearest hotel to have sex with Johns. That is fraud. When it comes to coercion, we often see, of course, substance abuse. So the federal government now recognizes substance abuse or substance use as a form of coercion. Because if I can get someone addicted to heroin, right? If I can get a 13-year-old addicted to heroin, and all of a sudden I'm her only supplier, that is absolutely coercive, When it comes to coercion, we often see rape, blackmail, beatings, threats. It's that manipulation piece that we see, the mind games going in. We see isolation playing a part in there. So between fraud and coercion, that grooming in piece, we see about 62% of those who are trafficked here in the U.S. are trafficked through fraud and coercion, through the grooming process. When it comes to that missing piece, right, we've got forced fraud and coercion. About 35% of those trafficked here in the U.S. are trafficked by family. So we have a huge issue when it comes to not being able to identify those within the family system who are trafficking their own. When it comes to global numbers, 2/3 of those who are trafficked by family. So an act of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, or selling, these are pretty self-explanatory activities. Anybody caught doing any of these activities with a means of and a purposes of is a trafficker. And anybody caught they're being done to them is a victim of trafficking. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to go through every definition of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, or selling, because again, they're in pretty simple terms. The federal government says, you know what? One element from each of those categories we just saw has to be present in order for the federal government to classify it as a human trafficking crime, or any commercial sex act or forced labor with a person under the age of 18. So the federal government says, you know what, if you're a child, you're entitled to all the same resources and services as any other victim. But please keep in mind about half of our states in this nation do not line up with this law and still prosecute children, still prosecute minors for prostitution. Some main elements of human trafficking include control, dependency, and exploitation. So when you're looking at this here, these just three very basic elements, control and dependency can describe many types of different relationships. So you can have grandparent, grandchild, parent, child, student, teacher. There's a lot of relationships we can assign to control and dependency. There must be an element of exploitation in order for it to be classified as human trafficking. So there's got to be some trade involved. For example, if a 14-year-old is being raped by her father, but he's not taking pictures, videos, he's not uploading them, he's not selling them, he's not trading her out to the neighbors, it is incest, it's rape, it's absolutely against the law. It is not human trafficking. There must be an element of trade. You may have heard the term modern day slavery. What this simply means is the United Nations has changed the definition of what slavery is. So it now includes anybody who is physically, psychologically, emotionally, or mentally unable to free themselves from their captor. So under this definition, we have more slaves in the world today than we've ever had in history. It crosses all socioeconomic statuses, races, and cultures. It doesn't matter if you're black, you're white, you're rich, you're poor, what neighborhood you grew up in. Anybody can be a victim of trafficking, and anybody can be a trafficker. However, there are some socioeconomic statuses, races, cultures, groups, some circumstances and situations that create greater risk for some than others. And we'll touch on that a little bit more as we go along. So it includes global, national, statewide, and local level. So it really doesn't matter where you are in the country or even in the world, human trafficking is happening. As we started developing these education seminars, it became very clear to us that people didn't quite understand the differences between human trafficking and some other crimes that are often associated with human trafficking. So I want to make sure these next 4 items, we know the difference between human trafficking as a crime and these other crimes. So they often include these things, but they're not these things exclusively. So the first one we're going to talk about is transportation. So about a third of victims actually never leave their city limits, but when we hear the term human trafficking, it sort of triggers this automatic, oh, they're traveling, because it's right in the term. So it's very easy to mistake that for frequent travel. It does happen, but it's not exclusively transportation. It also is different from smuggling. So smuggling is purposefully, right? So if I pay someone $3,000 to get me from another country into the United States, I get here and I'm off and running, I'm booking it. I am free to go. That is smuggling. That is not human trafficking. However, if when I get here, my trafficker or my driver, whatever, he says, you know what, it cost me $5,000 to get you here, and now you're going to work on this farm to pay it off. Now we have debt bondage. Now we have human trafficking. So it's different than simple transportation, okay, but often includes it. It's not familial sex abuse, although it often starts here. So we gave the example of the 14-year-old girl being raped by her father, right? So the data says more than 91% of those who are trafficked or have been trafficked have a history of early childhood sexual abuse. This is one of the #1 red flags we look for, and the group we work with the most when it comes to prevention for human trafficking. Because it is very, very closely related to sex trafficking and vulnerable victims. It's also not adult labor for low pay. It can include this, but it's not this exclusively. So the difference is if you are working in a job where you have agreed to work for a low wage and there is an element of freedom, if you can walk away from that job and go to the next one. So if you came here on a work visa and you are forced to work for that one company that guaranteed your work visa to get you here, and that one company says, I'm going to hold on to your documentation, I'm going to provide you with everything you need, but you can't go work for somebody else, and I'm going to make sure that you're deported if you do anything that I don't like. That is human trafficking. That is an element of coercion and should be looked at. However, it is not expressly adult labor for low pay. So if you're getting a pay, you've agreed to that pay, and there is an element of freedom. Hey, I can walk away from this. That is not human trafficking. It's not human trafficking without a trafficker unless you're under the age of 18. So basically, if we're talking about sex trafficking, it's not prostitution or it's not human trafficking without a pimp, right? It's actually prostitution. So if there's nobody in that control seat, I'm not dependent on them, and we don't have that element of exploitation happening, it is still prostitution. For example, if I'm 21 years old and I decide to put up my own ads, I say where I go, who I'm with, how much I make, where I live, I in every way have agency over my life, and I'm choosing to do this. This is prostitution. This is still a crime. About 10% of those in the commercial sex industry are what we call renegades. They're doing it of their own free will. So, sex trafficking victims and those who are choosing this as a profession often work side by side. So it can be very difficult to tell who is who. But keep in mind, there is still a difference between the two. So when you hear sex trafficking, it doesn't necessarily automatically mean prostitution. And when you hear prostitution, it doesn't necessarily automatically mean sex trafficking. Before we get too far into the numbers, please keep in mind that when it comes to human trafficking, it's an extremely underreported crime. So the numbers we have are pretty much educated guesses. So our federal government says we can logically prove we've got about 21 to 45 million people enslaved in the world today, which means about every 30 seconds someone new is forced, tricked, or coerced into human trafficking, creating about 1 million new victims every year. And right now, there are more than 750,000 child predators online looking to have sex with a child. It is the fastest growing criminal industry worldwide. It's the second largest criminal enterprise, and it generates an estimated $150 billion a year in revenue. Well, we talked about some global statistics. We talked about the global scope of this a little bit. Now on to the United States. So the United States is the #1 destination for Americans seeking sex with children. So what that simply means is several years ago, 15, 20 years ago, you would actually have to get on a plane and go to a different country to do the sorts of things to children that you can easily do to them here today. The sex trade here is the most common. So again, in the United States, Canada, Australia, parts of Europe, where we find that we've got a well-formed government, where we've got a good economic system, is where we often find sex and money as the currency. So the TVPA of 2015, the Reappropriations Act, said we can logically estimate we've got 77 to 82% of the trafficking that happens here in the U.S. is in the commercial sex industry. So we are one of the world's largest destinations for sex tourism. And what that simply means is sex tourism is I left my home country, my home state, my hometown to go somewhere else specifically to have sex with a child or pay for sex where it's illegal to do so. That is sex tourism. So no longer do we have to get on a plane and go to a different country, but we've got people from other countries who are coming here to pay and have sex with our children. The top 3 types of trafficking in 2018, and this continues to be the case, is sex trafficking. We often see escort agencies take that first spot, residential brothels, and pornography for sex trafficking. In labor trafficking, we see domestic work, so nannies, maids, janitorial work, agriculture and animal husbandry, so breeding, and traveling sales crews take the first 3 spots. When it comes to a combination of sex trafficking and labor trafficking, we often see illicit massage parlors, health and beauty, bars, strip clubs, cantinas, illicit activities. Human trafficking has been reported in all 50 states, so it does not matter what corner of the country you live in, human trafficking is happening in your community. Here is a map that Shared Hope International comes out with every year, and what it does is it gives us a picture of how well our states are doing as far as how well we protect victims and prosecute johns and traffickers. So you can sort of take a glance at this map and see where you are as far as how well your state is doing, and maybe contact your legislators, contact your local task force, and see what's happening in your community and see where you can help. So domestic victims are the majority of those who are trafficked here in the United States. Keep in mind, again, domestic victims are those who are born and raised here or are lawful citizens of the United States. It involves nearly 1 million men, women, and children here in the U.S., and we as a nation actually produce and distribute more than half of the world's pornography. So chances are what people are viewing overseas was produced and distributed from right here in the U.S. If you want to know more about what is happening as far as infant, toddler, and child pornography here in the U.S., there is a book called Epidemic, America's Trade in Child Rape. It is part of your reference list. It's a very good resource to understand the problem that we have with child pornography here in the U.S. According to the TVPA of 2000, an estimated 300,000 children are traded every year in the commercial sex industry. However, at the current moment, there are only a little over 1,700 beds nationwide to address the issue of minor sex trafficking. So when it comes to resources for children who have been trafficked or are being trafficked, the resources are very, very slim. 80% of those identified are female, 50% are children under the age of 18. But here's the thing, St. John University in New York did a study in 2017 and said that of those trafficked under the age of 18, 44% of them were actually boys. So we're missing a huge victim pool here because we're constantly looking for that male perpetrator and female victim, and we've got to flip it around. We see the rate of boys getting higher, we see the ages getting younger. We know now the market value for boys is higher than it is for girls right now. And why? Because we're not looking for them. It's very difficult to wrap our mind around boys being victims of human trafficking, and it's very difficult for them to identify themselves as being victims of human trafficking. We can't talk about human trafficking here in the U.S. without addressing one of our biggest populations of vulnerable victims, and that is our missing and runaway children. So every year, about 2.5 million kids actually run away, and most of them end up back home. But consistently, there are about 2 million children missing in America every year. A third of these children are called throwaways because no one bothered to report them missing. They either ran away, they got kicked out, they end up in emergency rooms, they end up in shelters, they end up sometimes dead. We don't know who they are or where they've come from. The average age of a child when forced, tricked, or coerced into sex trafficking is 11 to 13 years old for girls, 9 to 11 for boys. Again, this is an educated guess. The average age of those trafficked is actually about 9 to 19, but this is the average age from point of entry. The average lifespan from point of entry into sex trafficking is only 7 years. We often see substance abuse, so overdose, physical violence, murder, suicide, easily treatable, transmittable diseases taking these kids out early. So chances are if a little boy's trafficked at 12, he's not making it to 20. So just to put this in a little bit of perspective, I've got a friend, Sarah, who I have been friends with since we were 10 years old. And a couple years ago, she called me up and she says, you know, can you come down to Detroit? I really need you to come and talk to my girls. She's called Mom on the street. She's been trafficked out of Detroit for about 14 years. And she said, you know what? I've lost 3 of them this year. And the last one was 19 years old. She was on the street for about 6 months. My friend befriended her and convinced her to go into rehab. The day she got out of rehab, her pimp found her, shot her up with heroin, and she died of an overdose. Now, there was no news story about it that night. There was no fanfare. There was no obituary in the newspaper. There was no funeral to be had. Nobody missed this kid. She was a foster care child who had been from home to home to home to home. And when the check stopped coming at 18, she got dropped off at the shelter steps. So when it comes to life expectancy, when it comes to those who are trafficked and not missed, we're often missing it. They're dying before we even know that they're there, because oftentimes we see that they're part of the most vulnerable population here in the U.S. And we're talking about those who are in the foster care system, runaways, throwaway children, those who just didn't have a support system growing up. So forms of reported sex trafficking include any commercial sex act involving a child, pornography, massage parlors, spas, escort agencies, pimp-controlled prostitution, residential brothels, online solicitation, and strip clubs. So let's talk about online solicitation for just a moment. When it comes to initial contact, what we're seeing now is the majority of those, part of the vulnerable population who are groomed into this, are initially contacted through some form of online platform or social media app, like a Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat. But then we also see they turn around and are being sold through that same online platform or social media app for the purposes of a commercial sex act. So again, we see online playing a huge role when it comes to fueling human trafficking on the supply and the demand end of human trafficking. Let's talk a moment about residential brothels. A residential brothel can be anywhere. It can be in an apartment building, it can be in a trailer park, it can be in a middle-class neighborhood, a multi-million-dollar mansion. It really is just dependent on if you are being sold from the place where you live. That is a residential brothel. We also have what we call the weekend brothels. Oftentimes what we see is adults who have access to adolescents or children who tell the kids, you know what, bring over your friends, and they recruit them and they say, yeah, we're going to have a party this weekend. I know a great way you can make some money. That's what we call a weekend brothel. So keep in mind things to watch out for if there's security measures around that residence, if there's a lot of foot traffic around that residence, if there's domestic violence, if there is a lot of noise in the wee hours of the night. Those are things to watch out for residential brothels. The top venues for sex trafficking: hotels, motels, massage parlors, spas, or what we often see as Oriental or Asian spas, residential brothels, adult strip clubs, and street prostitution. Forms of labor trafficking include restaurants, bars, nail salons, hotels, agriculture, construction, traveling sales crews, begging, armed services, circus performers, folk dancers, and choir singers. So if you're a little curious, like I was when I first did the research, these last three that we see, circus performers, folk dancers, and choir singers, what we see is in underdeveloped nations, traffickers going in and convincing parents or even grandparents or the community that these children who they've identified talent in are going to be able to travel the world, they're going to make money, be educated, be able to send money back to the community. And before you know it, they've stolen the next generation from this village or community. They do travel the world in these groups performing. They are not educated. They do not make money. And when they're too old or worn out their usefulness, they're dropped off in whatever country they're in. When it comes to armed services, again, we often see this in war-torn nations. We see this in underdeveloped nations. We see this where we have smaller tribes and communities fighting other tribes and communities. We had a former child soldier in one of our seminars, and he said, by the time you're big enough, you're strong enough to carry a machine gun, you're part of the military. That's just all there is to it. There's no recruitment process. It's just an expected part of being part of the community. So when it comes to begging, we often have begging rings in certain communities where we've got people who are picked up and dropped off by the same people day after day at the same signs, at the same corners, and they give their trafficker, their drivers, their caretakers, all of their money because they're being provided with a place to live, food to eat, oftentimes drugs and alcohol, and all they got to do is go back out and do it again the next day. So panhandling or begging as a form of income when it is controlled by somebody else is a form of labor trafficking. Traveling sales crews, what we typically see now are 17 to 24-year-olds who are targeted and sold on a lifestyle. It's usually a party lifestyle. They're going to get to travel in the country and live in and out of hotel rooms. There's a lot of drugs, alcohol, sex involved. Generally, they're going to show up on your doorstep or at your agency or your business and try to sell you some story about earning points for a scholarship or an internship. They might be trying to sell magazines or household cleaning supplies or beauty products. Ask about it. Ask, what school they're going to, what program they're involved in, what state they're from. Call your local community and find out if there's a license for them to solicit in the area. They will probably have a piece of paper, but it is just a piece of paper. If they appear hungry, thirsty, need to use the bathroom, these are all huge red flags. If they're nervous because they're constantly looking behind them to see where their driver is, that's a huge red flag. Always call 911 if you feel like something is happening in the moment, but ask them, are you okay? Are you safe? Do you need me to call somebody for you? Give them a bottle of water, get them talking. You don't necessarily have to invite them in for family dinner, but don't slam the door in their face either. They may need help and you might be the one to provide it for them. Agriculture and construction groups, we do see these groups traveling in the country generally when the seasons are nice, so spring, summer, fall. It gets a little dicey in the winter in the north. So we do see these groups traveling where we often have seasonal construction and agriculture work happening. However, we don't generally know a whole lot about the group unless somebody goes in and begins an investigation, because what's happening is what the State Department is often finding is that people have agreed to work for a low wage. Again, there's got to be an element of restriction of freedom of movement in order for it to be human trafficking. So if there's an element of, I can go over here and get a job, I can go work over here, I don't have to stay here, then it's not human trafficking. But keep in mind that human trafficking does happen in these groups. Hotels, nail salons, restaurants, and bars. So we often see human trafficking happening here as well. So keep in mind where you've got a large population of employees who may not speak the language but have to translate between customer and the manager, that could be a huge red flag. Also, if there's a lot of security within the company, within the building, that's generally pointed at the employees, that's a huge red flag. If there's any indication that they're living on the premises, so is there bedding, is there toothpaste and toothbrush in the bathroom at the restaurant, is there a mattress in the alley behind the restaurant door, is there any indication that they're living on the premises? So we can't really talk about human trafficking or sex trafficking here in the U.S. without talking about our most vulnerable population, our runaway children. So 70% of those who run away are actually encountered by a child predator within 2 days. Sometimes we're seeing this in a lot less time. One, because we've got children who have access to the internet at a much younger age and they're on Facebook or Instagram, Snapchat, I hate my parents, I'm out of here, I'm running away, and they don't know who they friended. And before you know it, they've got someone on there who says, just give me your address, I'll be out to pick you up. And they're traffickers in the driveway before they even hit the door. Predators know exactly what to look for. They know based on how somebody walks, how they talk, if they make eye contact. They know within 8 minutes if they've got someone on the hook as a human trafficking victim. It doesn't take much. So we can't talk about human trafficking without talking about the main elements or why it's happening. And the biggest answer is demand. If nobody were demanding infant, toddler, child pornography, if nobody were demanding sex with children, if nobody were demanding free or cheap labor, nobody would be supplying it. And we often find these next elements part of the demand side of human trafficking. So increased globalization, our ability to contact others around the world and vice versa. Gender inequalities, 99% of those on the demand end are men. The buyers, are majority of them are men. Lack of accountability for pimps, the suppliers, and Johns, the buyers. So when we talk about the players of human trafficking, we talk about suppliers, we talk about buyers. We talk about those who fuel human trafficking. So we'll get into it a little bit later. We'll talk about perpetrators, those who are fueling human trafficking, but we often talk about pimps, Johns, and pedophiles. And they are different groups. Sometimes they overlap, but when we're talking about perpetrators, pimps again, suppliers, Johns, buyers, pedophiles often are fueling the demand for infant, toddler, and child pornography, which is sex trafficking. So lack of services for victims once they're rescued. This is a huge issue for rescue agencies, for different community agencies around the country, because once we have a victim, once we have someone who's been recognized as being exploited, it's very difficult to find the next steps, whether it be shelter or medical services or detox, whatever the need might be, and then move from one service to the next so that they actually come from rescued to recovered. It's a very long process, and it involves a lot of different service agencies in between. So ease of mobility, the ability to move across the country from state to state, whatever that might be, or even, from one country to the next. Ease of access to pornography. So again, over the last, 15 years or so, the rate of the internet and the amount of children who now have access to the internet on an unfettered basis, or, sort of a free reign, has put pornography in their faces at a very young age. So now we're seeing children 8, 9, 10 years old with addiction to porn because they have access to Google. You got access to Google, you have access to porn. Access to YouTube, it has porn. Some video games that children are playing and adults are playing have porn. So it's very important to recognize the role that pornography has played in being a catalyst. Oftentimes, when we're talking about Johns who have been caught trying to solicit or who are purchasing sex from children or adults, oftentimes the excuse or the process that we hear about is the impact of pornography. It started out as an addiction, couldn't put it down, couldn't stop thinking about it, was at work thinking about it, was up all night, and then it began to escalate. So it wasn't, fetishy enough, it wasn't violent enough, they weren't young enough. And then the third phase is they started to normalize or desensitize themselves to what they were thinking, feeling, and doing. Well, my girlfriend didn't say anything last night, or my husband didn't say anything last week. They do this to girls in this age. We just haven't caught on yet. So anything they can do to justify what they are feeling, thinking, and eventually doing. So the fourth phase then is acting out. And this often can include, obviously, when we're talking about Johns, we're talking about people who have or who have tried to purchase. But this can also include people who have molested children, people who have gone out to rape. So this acting out sexually can come in a lot of different variety and actually start with pornography. I want to be very clear though, just because it is a process of addiction does not excuse the bad behavior. There has to be accountability in place when it comes to those who are purchasing or trying to purchase. Otherwise, the demand end just continues to grow. Part 2, social media and types of predators. When it comes to social media, again, we often find initial contact being made through social media sites and online platforms. So we're going to talk just a little bit about social media and this distance contacting that we have when it comes to those who are being groomed for human trafficking. Some examples of apps used for nefarious purposes include Snapchat, Instagram, Tinder, Facebook, Periscope. There are a ton of apps and social media platforms that are used by traffickers to contact and groom potential victims. There are 15,000 new apps created every single week. So it is very difficult to have the capacity to keep up with the amount of apps that are hitting the internet, hitting our phones, hitting our iPads and computers. So online games with chat capability also have great capacity for perpetrators to initially contact and groom victims. When it comes to online gaming, this can be a very dangerous world, especially for adolescents and children who don't know how to navigate having chat sessions with people that they don't know from around the world. So keep in mind that anywhere you have vulnerable populations, which of course our children and adolescents are vulnerable simply because of their developmental stage. So wherever you have vulnerable populations, you have predators lurking, and that includes online games. Many of the apps that we have on our phones, on our watches, on our iPads and computers come with location services. They come with geomapping and GPS. Be sure to turn these off on your individual apps so that when you're talking to somebody, whether it's on Tinder or Snapchat or even Facebook, they cannot just click on a button, find out where you are geographically. Many of these apps have them embedded within them, so you need to go in and turn them off individually. Warning signs of online predators can include if they have no friends in common with you, if the picture is really low quality, if it is grainy and it seems like it's been downloaded from the internet and uploaded to their own profile. If they have a picture of them with a child or acting as a loving father, grandfather, mother, grandmother, but that's the only picture that they have. And today was the first day they decided to create a Facebook page. That's a huge warning sign. And if they only have a few friends on their friends list, or even none at all. Some other warning signs could include if they're overly interested in your profession, in your family, in your friends, what you do in your downtime. So beware also that if you instantly get a private message, hey, how are you? How's things going? And you don't know who the person is, that's also a huge red flag. It's very important to know that you can block and report any suspicious activity that you see on your social app or social media platform. Stay alert and aware of the lifestyle of your friends. So many of the times we've gotten a report of sex trafficking or sexual abuse from a friend, because friends often see what's going on in others' lives, but they don't often see it when it's happening with themselves. So pay attention to what's happening on around you. Never sending any pictures, videos. We know, texts, they never go away, even if you delete them. So I always tell my kids, if you don't want to see it on a billboard on the freeway, don't put it online, because that's what you're doing. So setting privacy settings to private or friends only can really slow down the amount of predators that you will get, or your children or adolescents will get on their pages or social media apps. Keep in mind, it won't stop all of them, but it will slow down a great majority of them. Some different types of predators that we see in human trafficking. A trafficker is any supplier of persons for sexual laborious purposes. A pimp is a specific type of trafficker for commercial sex. A John is a purchaser of sex. A pedophile often is in demand for infant, toddler, child sexual contact or content. All of these types of predators play a role in fueling human trafficking. What does a trafficker look like? They look just like you and me. You cannot tell by looking at somebody if they are a predator or not. You simply cannot tell. They are men, women, young, old, black, white, Hispanic, everything you can possibly think of. You cannot tell by looking at somebody if they are a predator or not. So I worked in the courthouse for a little while in Genesee County, where Flint is, and more than once did I mistake the pimp, the trafficker, for the attorney, because he was dressed very, very nice in a suit, very intelligent, usually talking to an attorney or a police officer, very confident. So you cannot tell by looking at somebody if they are a predator or not. Some myths about predators is one, that they're always men. We know this isn't true. About 24% of those who run their own sex trafficking ring, residential brothel, and produce and distribute infant, toddler, and child pornography are actually women. Another myth is that they're always old and creepy. Now, some are, right? They get older, but your average rapist is 31 years old. Your average trafficker, 28 and a half years old. Another myth is that they are dumb. They are not dumb. They are generating $150 billion a year in revenue. This is money that goes straight into their pockets. They know how to run their business. They know how to get around laws. They know how to network with other people and companies. They are not dumb. Another myth is that they are loners. The average time when somebody makes a date to rape a child for that evening is between 2 and 4 p.m. from a work computer. They have jobs, they have families, they have friends, not the loners that we typically think of. Another myth is that they pick strangers to kidnap and violate. We know that more than 97% of those who are trafficked know their trafficker. This is not true. Behaviors of sexual predators, some common traits they have in common, whether it's online or in real life. So most predators are very outgoing and engaging, very friendly, whether it's online or in person. They actively target their victims, whether it's in the neighborhood, on the internet, at work, at school. They're looking for vulnerabilities and they're actively targeting victims. It's not by random chance that they just pick a victim. Be aware that online predators can be complete strangers or someone you do actually know. Be wary of requests to meet. So we had a case a couple years ago in our little town. Her 15-year-old had put on Facebook a video of her singing, and within a couple of hours a predator popped up and said, "Oh, I'm a recording artist. I would love to record your demo. Meet me here, but don't tell your parents yet." She was excited. She thought this was her big break. She thought she had been discovered. It was because a friend noticed that something wasn't quite adding up. We were able to intervene before that went down, but it can happen that quickly. So be wary of requests to meet. Watch out for flattery. They're going to use anything they can, any kind of emotional manipulation to bolster self-esteem. They're making positive comments on videos, pictures, I like your puppy, whatever the case might be. Don't fall prey to false promises of a job or a profession. Emily, from the very beginning, fell right into this. She was promised a job as a waitress, ended up in servitude as a stripper. We often see this in the entertainment profession, whether it's modeling, recording artists, other entertainment professionals. So just be aware that oftentimes predators will use this to entice young people into what they think is their big break. Identifying suspicious behavior. So don't tell your parents we've been talking, I'll find out. This is a huge red flag for those of us who are trained to see it. For a 13-year-old, this feels a little bit off. So keep in mind when you're looking at whether it's your child or it's a student or just somebody in your life and you start to see things like this or start to hear things like this is a huge red flag. This is not going to get better from here. Leaving any chat room or social media outlet you feel threatened, that you don't feel safe in. It's okay to block and report when things happen. There are some chat rooms, there are some groups that are set up specifically for people who have vulnerabilities, like a mental illness. Guaranteed, there are predators lurking around those groups. So just be aware and be on the lookout. Look for changes in someone's behavior, maybe not even necessarily a child, but if someone's being extremely secretive about online activities, or if they're obsessed with something that's happening online, they hide their screen, they're receiving and sending phone calls and texts from people you don't know or even they don't know. Especially when it comes to children and adolescents, if they're showing up with a lot of stuff that you don't buy for them, if they show up with a bunch of cell phones, if they show up with handbags, if they show up with their hair done and their nails done and they don't have a job and you didn't purchase it for them, those are huge red flags. Whether they're children or adults, one of the first things we see is a very quick psychological, emotional attachment to somebody. So it can be a very quick process to, I just met this person and we are so in love. And then across the board, your pimps, your suppliers, your buyers, your pedophiles, across the board, narcissistic characteristics, an overinflated sense of entitlement. I can get what I want from who I want, whenever I want, without consequence. They're often right about the no consequence. However, what we see is across the board, narcissistic characteristics. And you know what? Trust your gut. If it feels off, it's off. We've been given our intuition, our felt sense, our gut for a reason. Follow it and follow up with it, because chances are you are not wrong. Understanding the grooming process is very important. Predators actively target their victims by looking for vulnerabilities, and they gain the victim's trust by filling a need. So whatever that vulnerability says to them, that's the need they're going to fill. For example, if a 12-year-old is sitting online, she comes home from school and mom works 2 jobs, mom doesn't get home till 10 o'clock at night, and she's on Facebook, I'm so bored, can anybody FaceTime with me? I don't know what to do today, I don't have any friends. Those are huge red flags and invitations for predators to hop online with her. Her need might be affection, it might be attention. Same goes for, a 13-year-old who has just been kicked out of her 4th foster care home. She's on the street and she hasn't eaten in 2 days. Her need might be very basic. She might need some food, right? And she's going to trust whoever that is who's giving her the food at least in enough time to get what she needs. If I have grown up in a very impoverished neighborhood and I have a hard time finding shoes or a coat to walk to school in the middle of winter, it's going to sound really nice to have new clothes, to have my hair done, to ride in a nice car. Gifts might actually be my need. They begin to isolate the victim, separating them from their support system. That's if they have one, right? So we often hear, well, they don't love you like I do. They don't understand our kind of connection. And they begin to drive a wedge between victim and support system. They begin to sexualize interaction. So online, we often see it can start out as very unassuming pictures or videos and get more and more sexually explicit as time goes on, getting them normalized, right? Getting them desensitized to sexual interaction and sexual acts. In person, this can be a process of weeks, months, or even years of grooming a child from one innocent touch to the next week coming over, and it's a little bit more crossing a boundary. Now the hand is on the leg. The next week it's a little bit farther. And before you know it, the child has normalized the interaction that's happening. Maintaining control, the use of threats, perceived guilt, violence, rape, blackmail, sextortion. I would add to this list substance abuse. We often see substance abuse as a form of maintaining control along with the grooming process, right? Because again, if I can get a 13-year-old addicted to heroin and now I'm her only supplier, right? Control, dependency, and exploitation slips right in. When it comes to maintaining control, we often see an emotional, psychological attachment to one's captor, right? So we see Stockholm Syndrome, we see those trauma bonds happening. When it comes to blackmail online or over the internet, it's called sextortion. So if someone sends an explicit or a naked photo to somebody else and they're like, you know what, you need to send me more, otherwise I'm going to spread this all over the internet, that is sextortion. That is a form of maintaining control in sex trafficking. Part 3. Hotels, motels, and public lodging establishments. Some common warning signs in public lodging establishments. If individuals show signs of fear, anxiety, tension, submission, and or nervousness. If they show signs of physical abuse, restraint, and or confinement. If they exhibit evidence of verbal threats, emotional abuse, and or being treated in a demeaning way. Show signs of malnourishment, poor hygiene, fatigue, sleep deprivation, untreated illness, injuries, and or unusual behavior. Keep an eye out for individuals who have a lack of freedom of movement or are constantly monitored. If they avoid eye contact and interaction with other people. If they have no control over their possessions, their money, their identification, if they dress inappropriately for their age or have a lower quality clothing compared to others in their party, have few or no personal items, such as no luggage or no bags. If individuals appear to be with significantly older boyfriend or in the company of older males, a group of girls appear to travel with an older female or male, a group of males or females with identical tattoos in similar locations. Signs of human trafficking for housekeeping, maintenance, and room service staff. If you see do not disturb signs in constant use, requests room or housekeeping services, additional towels, linens, etc., but denies hotel motel staff entry into room, refusal of cleaning services for multiple days, excessive amounts of cash in the room, smell of bodily fluids and musk, presence of multiple computers, cell phones, pagers, credit card swipers, and other technology, and if the same person is reserving multiple rooms. If individuals leaving the room frequently or not at all or at odd hours, children's items or clothing are present but no child is registered to that room, individuals loitering in the hallways or appearing to monitor the area, excessive amounts of alcohol or illegal drugs in the room, evidence of pornography, minors left alone in room for long periods of time. Warning signs continued. Excessive number of people staying in a room, extended stay with few or no personal possessions, provocative clothing and shoes, constant flow of men into a room at all hours, excessive amounts of sex paraphernalia in the room, condoms, lubricant, lotion, etc. Rooms stocked with merchandise, luggage, mail packages, purses, wallets with different names. Signs of human trafficking for concierge, bellman, front desk, security, and valet staff. Patrons checking into a room appear distressed or injured. The same person reserving multiple rooms. Few or no personal items when checking in. Room paid for with cash or preloaded credit card. Excessive use of hotel computers for adult-oriented or sexually explicit websites. Patrons not forthcoming about full names, home address, or vehicle information when registering. If a minor is taking on adult roles or behaving older than actual age, for instance, if they're paying bills, requesting services, patron appears with a minor that he or she did not come with originally. Rentals of pornography when children are staying in the room. Individuals dropped off at the hotel or visit repeatedly over a period of time. Individuals leaving room infrequently, not at all, or at odd hours. If a minor is with a patron late night or during school hours and not on vacation, individuals checking into room have no identification. Room is rented hourly, less than a day, or for long-term stays that does not appear normal. Patrons request information or access to adult services or sex industry. Room rented has fewer beds than patrons. How to report. Well, congratulations for making it this far. So I want to talk to you about how to prevent human trafficking from happening. What you're doing right now is the key. Becoming educated is the key, and then telling everybody what you now know. You are a first responder not because of the profession that you are in or because of where you work. You are a first responder because you are human. Human trafficking is a human issue, and most of the time, human trafficking happens through the context of relationship. It is important for you as a human being to know the signs, to know it when you see it, and to know how to report. So what you need to do is develop an in-house protocol using the assessment questions and HIPAA compliance. We'll talk about HIPAA in just a minute. If you are in a position to do so, creating empowerment programs, or even just with your own kids or grandkids. Confidence creates greater safety. Be proactive. Make sure that the young ones around you know how to walk with confidence, know how to talk with confidence. They know how to say no and stick with their no. They know how to give a firm handshake. They know how to look people in the eye. If you start with the physical, the emotions will follow. So start with acting and presenting yourself and helping your children around you be confident in a physical way, and the emotions of confidence will come along shortly. The community response to human trafficking is this. Do not at any time attempt to confront a suspected trafficker directly or alert a victim to your suspicions. Now again, if you are in a clinical setting and they come to you, it is different. You are going to try to separate the two of them if you can do it safely. But if you are out in the community or you work in a place where they're not coming to you and sitting in a clinical office or in a classroom, do not attempt to confront the suspected trafficker directly. Call 911 for emergency situations, threats of violence, physical assault, emergency medical needs, but also you can call 911 if you suspect that it's happening. Follow your corporate protocol, such as notifying management and security. You're also going to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline number at 1-888-3737, 888, or text help or info to Be Free, 233-733. You can also call DHS, so 866-DHS-2-ICE, 1-866-347-2423 to report suspicious criminal activity to federal law enforcement. Anonymous tips can be left at their website, www.ice.gov/tips. If you have a victim with you and they are ready to report, if they're over the age of 18, you must get written or verbal consent in order to disclose any kind of identifying information. So their age, their name, the specifics of the incident. So if you're on the phone with somebody and they give you verbal consent, make sure you document it in your notes immediately. There's a saying in the clinical world of if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Call if a staff or patient is in imminent danger. So you're going to call 911 and you can disclose whatever you like and remain HIPAA compliant. You're always going to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline number for resources. And if the person that you're working with is over the age of 18, they're in need of resources, call the hotline and give a hypothetical. You do not have to disclose their name, their birthday. You may have to give an age range depending on the resource needed, the gender. You do not have to give the date of incident. So call with a hypothetical and get resources that way. For resources in Florida, the abuse hotline is 1-800-96-ABUSE or 1-800-962-2873. The Florida Agency for Workforce Innovation, Migrant and Seasonal Farm Work Exploitation is 1-800-633-3572. Again, if you suspect anything, 911 and the National Human Trafficking Hotline number, 1-888-3737, 888, or text Be Free, 233-733. If you need resources and you don't know what's in your area, you're going to go to www.polarisproject.org. You're going to click on their menu, and where it says Get Assistance, it'll pop up a map of the United States. All you have to do is scroll over the area where you need resources, and it will give you a list of all the agencies listed to help those who have been trafficked, whether it's legal help, medical, detox, mental health. The resources are there. So start at polarisproject.org. Human Trafficking 101, Story, Stats, and Solution is a book that I wrote 2018. It was published and it's available on Amazon. If you bought this as part of a comprehensive training program, you have this book with you. If you want additional copies, again, they're available through Amazon. If you're watching this or going through this training program as part of your requirement, whether it's for a public lodging establishment or mental health or healthcare, you are required to take a quiz and then you will receive your certificate. Your certificate should be handled by your program manager or your education manager, whoever's in charge of setting you up with this training. So they have access to the downloadable certificates. So take the quiz. You must pass by 70%, which isn't much. The questions are pretty easy. So after this, you will have been certified and trained in human trafficking identification and response. So congratulations for completing the training. I want to thank you for taking the time out to get yourself educated on such an important issue. Please go out there and tell others what you have learned. If you would like to request me as a speaker, please go to www.humantraffickingeducationseminars.com, or you can call 810-399-9713. Thank you so much for taking this training course and have a blessed day.